Thank you for having me again. And this is the last time that you'll hear from me this week unless I answer one question during Something Chumps. So today, the second thing I want to talk about is kind of kinship networks and thinking a little bit differently about sort of our social relationships and social networks. When you think of social networks, I think most people in their head envision like a friendship network, the kind of school-based network that Bob was talking about and others. And that really has kind of dominated the field, but I think that's actually kind of to the detriment of the field. So I'm going to give an overview of kind of how I think about where kinship networks fit in the social networks and health space, and talk about kind of key gaps in current knowledge. And there's a lot of gaps in current knowledge, but one area that I paid a lot of attention to kind of recently is this kind of demography of kinship and trying to understand what I think of as really simple questions like, how many siblings does the average person have? Which are actually not well answered in the literature. And then I'm going to use that to kind of hop into some kind of cool tools that have kind of come onto the scene in the last 5 years or so. I would say like 15 years ago, people started really redeveloping these tools, including some of my contributions in that area. But in the last 5 years, maybe 6 years, they've really taken off. And so there's like a really cool time. It's a cool time to be interested in this and to do exciting work that I think has broad kind of policy, public health, and kind of theoretical interest for current kind of scholars. And so I'll go through the kind of tools that exist, talk through the actual tools, and give some examples with some code, which it's our code. So I usually do this stuff in like MATLAB or Stata. And so this is, you're going to like open the R code and look at it and be like, this person does not know. It's like looking at Medusa or something. You're going to turn to stone. But the code, I believe it will run. So if it doesn't run, I still have the takeaway points that I can highlight. So when you think about social networks and health, I think most people, as I said, think about friendship networks or other kind of affiliation networks. And if you look at the literature on this topic, that is certainly the case. If you do Web of Science searches for social networks and you try and put in kind of other terms to see like what kind of networks people are talking about, 75,000 articles have the word social networks in the title, abstract, and keywords. And only 8% of those talk about other types of relationships, right? Family, kinship. In the Journal of Social Networks, I was able to like go through the specific articles. It's a much more manageable number. And you see it's kind of about 10% of them are really focused on family and kinship networks. And most of the rest are focused on broader sets of affiliation or don't explicitly talk about family relationships within that. Despite that kind of focus on non-family-based ties, I think that it's an underappreciated fact of many networks that a substantial number of the ties in the networks that we're interested in are actually family ties. So the example that I love to pull, like trot out on this one, is the Framingham Heart Study data that was so popularized by Fowler and Christakis' analysis of like smoking contagion, obesity contagion, happiness contagion. There's a couple other ones that they did in it. And this is the data set. This is in the kind of Museum of Science in Boston, which I think is kind of a cool accomplishment. And that network graph of the kind of network of ties among people in the Framingham kind of heart study, that they used the contact information, as Bob was talking about, to follow up with people, and they took that and turned it into a social network. But if you actually look at the ties in that data, about 55% of those ties are close family ties, so spouse, sibling, parent, child. And I think when you think of that, it really reframes their results away from this idea of like, oh, the contagion of obesity to like interpersonal family dynamics being a critical part of that really implicates some of the critiques that were leveled against it, like genetics and other things like that might be unobserved confounders. And if you look at other kind of data sets, you also see a similar pattern. So I think one that's like very famous, kind of popularized by Miller McPherson and Elizabeth Lovin, was this idea of kind of American, and Peter Marsden before that, American social relationships, who we talk to about important matters. If you use the GSS question about important matters and you ask people, and you look at who people are referring to, you know, about 69% of the population were nominating more family ties that they talk to about important matters compared to the number of friend ties they nominated. And then last, like a really classic kind of 1969 book during the era pre-Roe when abortion was illegal, Another book was that kind of popularized the notion of we go to our networks to find difficult things. We go to like search extensively. It's called Search for Abortionist among women that needed to find someone who could perform an abortion for them. And about 50% of the searchers, the first people they asked in that network were family members, which I think runs contrary to the classic narrative of like how we access our social networks. There are others that are not as dominated by family networks, like kind of the original Small World study. Only 14% of letters were sent to family members in that study, but that still is, I think, a relatively substantial proportion of the letters that you're passing on to try from somebody randomly in Kansas or Nebraska or something to send a letter to somebody in Boston. It's like, oh, I'll just send it to a family member. That's a good way to get a tie to some letter to someone I don't know across the country. And similarly, like in early Granovetter work on kind of strength of weak ties, about 30% of the ties of the jobs that people found were through family members. So when we think of weak ties, we don't usually think of family, but in that data set, a lot of the original kind of findings were based on family ties. And then just to really hammer in on this point, this is analyzing a couple different waves of the general social survey. This is by age of the respondents. This is the number of family-based ties people have, the number of non-family-based ties people have. This, at certain points in our life course, family ties are incredibly dominant, particularly in the older adult portion of the life course. When we think of who the average 70-year-old communicates with about important matters, I think across different groups, across different time periods, we should think it's going to be a family member is a really critical part of that. And that's a lot of my kind of research interests. This is another American Time Use survey, like who people spend time with at different points. Same basic idea, you're spending a lot of time with family as you get older. So what do we know about those family ties from a kind of social networks perspective? There's a really broad anthropological kind of tradition on this topic that tries to kind of enumerate different family structures, family systems. One that I always kind of think about, and it relates to the Anatomy of Kinship book that Jim talked about, was these early anthropological efforts to say, like, America uses what they called the Eskimo kinship system. So we refer to ties kind of in this way, that like we distinguish siblings from cousins, but other cultures maybe don't do that as much. They maybe group different kinds of cousins, different kinds of relations in different ways, right? So there was a long anthropological tradition to classify societies by their kin categories, a lot of anthropological work on this topic. So there's a great rich tradition in that area, but there's a lot less known about the sociological aspects of this, in my opinion. So a lot of the possible insights about kinship networks and family networks, I think, are obscured. A big reason for that is this kind of theoretical focus on peer effects and social networks. And sort of related to that, this split between the literatures focused on family, which are largely conducted by one group of people, and the literatures focused on social networks, which are largely conducted by a pretty separate group of people. And they are not in as much conversation as I think would be ideal. Another big feature in that family kind of side of things is that most social data collection that occurs at sort of the population level tends to enumerate household-based ties and asks very few ties that exist outside of the household. So this is a critique that the social networks literature has leveled at it, but I think it's a critique that you could level up for trying to understand family or kinship dynamics as well. For instance, very few surveys ask people, like, how many living siblings do you have? That's just not a very well-known thing, and it's a challenge for trying to make inferences about sort of kinship distributions in the population. And then last, I think that this kind of traces to like kind of Marx and Engels kind of theoretical tradition, where there's this kind of idea that family and kinship networks are important for kind of historical populations, small-scale tribal populations, et cetera. But in advanced industrial economies, we don't rely on these types of ties. They don't matter as much. And so I think that kind of has, the combination of these things have led to this kind of weird cycle where what we're looking at in terms of kind of family relationships constrains what we find, which then further constrains the types of questions that we ask, which further constrains what we look at, et cetera. So with survey data, we can learn a lot about family relationships and how they influence us. For instance, here's some work that I had done on COVID, where we tried to examine, like if your family member dies of COVID, is that worse than if they die of a different disease? And we found that for loneliness and depression and trouble sleeping, that when your spouse dies of COVID, you're more likely to have a higher level of loneliness or depression than you would expect otherwise if they died of another kind of cause. And so we found this kind of difference, family kind of influence of a specific cause of death, but we could only look at spouses, and it was really a frustrating aspect of the survey that we couldn't look at, well, what's the influence of like other people that matter to you dying? So that was a real constraint that data posed for us. And what I have found in a lot of my recent work, which is sort of flipping the equation from looking at how many ties you have to how many ties you might have lost in this kind of family space, I found that everywhere that I've looked, they seem to matter. And one area that I think is kind of surprising is, I think it's a pretty surprising one, is the loss of grandparents. So we looked for children in the Future of Families and Child Wellbeing study, and we looked at what happens to their educational trajectories and various other kind of health measures when they experience the death of a grandparent. So we think of the death of a grandparent as like a pretty normative thing that happens in your teenage years, your early 20s. This is thought to be like a really common experience, and it actually is a pretty common experience. But people historically have thought like, oh, that's just normal, it's expected, who would be disrupted by that? But what we found is, and across different outcomes, verbal and math scores, depression, externalizing behavior, so some delinquent and criminal justice system involvement kind of behaviors, subsequent educational attainment, and like epigenetic aging kind of measures, that across all of these different things, a little bit differently depending on the group we're looking at, but across all of them, losing your grandparent during childhood or teenage years is detrimental for your kind of outcomes. So this graph shows an example for Black, Hispanic, and white boys, grandmother, grandfather deaths, and particularly, not all of these are significant, but particularly for Black and Hispanic children, we see pretty strong negative influences of losing a grandparent on their kind of test scores. We see similar results for teens, adolescents, and other kind of ways of cutting the data, which I think this is an exciting area, and there's been this kind of groundswell of research on thinking about what happens when we lose family members, how these family ties are kind of influencing us. And so I wrote with my colleague from University of Southern California, Emily Smith Greenaway, and Debbie Carr from Boston University. We recently wrote an annual review article trying to synthesize the sociology of kind of bereavement research. And one of the things that we kind of concluded within that is that there was an early psychological focus. This tradition emerged from psychology, and it really focused on what happens when your spouse dies, what happens when you're a kid and your parent dies, what happens when, those are the two biggest ones. What happens to people when their child dies is the other one. And it was very individualized, very kind of psychological, and all this evidence that like it's bad for people's mental health. But when you trace the literature over time, that really started to expand in the kind of tradition of studying it. So in the post-2000s, people started thinking about like, how does widowhood, how is that moderated by the amount of social support that's available to you? How is the negative influence of widowhood on your health kind of moderated? And the thing that has kind of emerged post-2010, but really closer to 2020, has been what we're calling this kind of focus on the social demography of bereavement and trying to understand, all right, well, we know that this is pretty, not uniformly, but pretty across the board bad for people. What are actually the ties that people are losing? And that question is actually still not very well answered. So that's some of the stuff that I've been trying to do in the last couple of years, and I'll have some examples at the end of this. So just a quick kind of social demography of bereavement I define as like the prevalence, determinants, and consequences of bereavement. And I think it's really important to understand it to help us feel a sense of the ways that bereavement is inequitably structured across society, how some groups maybe experience it younger, how some groups experience it at higher levels, some of the kind of experiences of it might be more traumatic than other experiences, and all of these things have kind of remained unanswered. And so we can turn to the tools of kind of kinship modeling to begin to answer that question. Unfortunately, survey data, particularly for bereavement, but I also think for kinship in general, is really inadequate to characterize this stuff. Because we only typically ask about household members, we can't enumerate, for instance, how many siblings the average 45-year-old has versus the average 35-year-old. We can't enumerate how that might have changed in the last 20 years. These kinds of questions are kind of obscured. In addition, if we want to study bereavement, it's even more problematic because not all of our siblings are going to die, right? And so they will eventually, but not all of them will have died at any given point in time. And so sample sizes are way too small to do many comparisons. A really influential study on this was by Deb Umberson, looking at the AdHealth data and some other data sources. And she tried to characterize, like, what's the white-black gap in experiencing the death of a close family member by age 30, by age 40, et cetera. And what she did in that data set is use the kind of experiences of death in the ad health data. And what you see here is Black Americans had substantially higher risks of losing a loved one, but because they're a smaller proportion of the population, you only end up with like 400 white mother deaths, 375 Black mother deaths among the 20,000 or so ad health participants, right? So this kind of challenge leads to, we can't cut that in many more ways than we can't look at things like, oh, well, how does social support moderate it? There's a lot of limitations on the kind of survey data, and it really obscures questions like, what about Native American populations? What about Hispanic populations and other groups that might be of real interest in trying to understand inequality and the experience of family death? So taking it out of the bereavement space, even though I think they're very linked, I think we're kind of in a really exciting golden age for kinship demography research. In particular, there's a lot of surging interest kind of post-2010 in this kind of kinship demography question of like, how many siblings do people have? How many children does the average 80-year-old have? How does that impact their possibility of getting care and caregiving and informal kind of social support and things like that? So there's a real surge of interest in this. I think that's driven by the fact that the population is getting older. So if you think about where we are kind of as a country, more and more people have moved to that part of the important matters graph where family ties are the dominant part. Part of that is driven by like population decline. So like we have seen these really interesting demographic patterns that have unfolded over the last 30 to 75 years in different countries that are leading to like big changes in these things all of a sudden. And we also are in a situation where there is kind of disinvestment or lack of continued investment in kind of public infrastructure. And so there's probably a real need to rely on kind of family members for informal care in a way that maybe wasn't always the case historically. Last, I think that we have a lot of new tools to be able to do this research that's really exciting. So I'll talk more about that. To characterize the kinship modeling kind of space, there are three broad approaches. One is you use the survey data that are available. Unfortunately, it's not as much as you might hope, but you can still do clever things like we did with Future Families and Child Wellbeing Study, where we were able to look at, all right, they had grandmothers alive at birth, the grandmother was alive at wave 7, or age 7, the grandmother was alive at age 15, and died between age 7 and age 15, so we can look at the influence of grandmother death in that kind of window. There's also kind of interesting, exciting administrative data approaches for this. I know some people that are using register data to, for instance, look at this, but I've talked a little bit enough about that, and I want to turn to the area that I think maybe will be more appealing to a social networks kind of audience, because you can play around with exciting kind of network analysis toolkits with it and try and understand like how things are changing. So the two broad kind of modeling-based approaches, the first one is to what I call like simulating the network. So in this approach, you have agents of some sort within the computer doing different things that are evolving according to some sort of probabilistic rates that could be matched to reality. So that might be giving birth, marrying, getting divorced, having children, dying, migrating. And you can simulate all these things and track what the kinship network evolution looks like under that kind of model. That was the area that I worked in for quite a while. And I've increasingly turned away from that area because it is really hard to do that kind of stuff. It's very hard to get the models to converge. There's a lot of programming challenges with it. And I've increasingly moved to this other area, which has kind of really been revitalized in recent years, that are a set of analytical tools to model kinship and family networks. So just an overview of the demographic microsimulation approach. Basically, you can take in a bunch of different rates like remarriage, divorce, marriage, mortality, et cetera. People in your agents in your little simulation can do those things. Like in 2010, the probability of giving birth if you have never had children before is X. And if you've had one child, it's Y. And you can model people evolving according to these things and trace out the kinship networks from it. And as you can see, you might start with a group of people, and some of them kind of people migrate into the village, and some people die, and other people migrate out. And you can sort of trace the kinship network as it evolves over time in that simulation. And there's some cool applications you can do with this. In particular, if you're interested in understanding kin sets of like how many, not the expected average number of siblings people have, but how many people are in really big families versus really small families. You can look at some kind of population dispersion within that. And you can do some kind of in-law relationships and things like that. So an example that I like to give for this is some work I had done on Chinese kind of kinship models. The traditional view of Chinese society is that it was really dominated by extended kinship kind of ties. This is purportedly a Chinese family from the kind of early 1900s. You can see there's lots of living relatives, et cetera. And so I take Chinese demographic statistics for a long time and simulate kind of the evolution of the kinship networks in like a hypothetical China based that follows the demographic patterns of China. And the model, these are kind of actual rates here that were used as inputs, and these are the estimated kind of fertility rates from the model. It performs really well in sort of replicating the basic demography of the country. And the answer we got from this was completely different than the answer that I think most people expect. The answer that we got is that the era of kind of peak family in China is not that classic traditional era. It's actually the contemporary era. If you look at the classic period, numbers of total family members were pretty small. The reason they were pretty small is because most people were dying in infancy and childhood, right? People were not surviving their whole lives. But as the demographic transition unfolded and mortality rates fell, so babies stopped dying while people were still having large numbers of babies, the number of people available kind of ballooned, the number of children that women had surviving ballooned, the number of siblings people had ballooned. That translated to more aunts and uncles, which translated to more cousins. And we're currently in the period where that accumulation of all of those things is reaching a very, very high level. This is for 40 to 49-year-olds. You get obviously a different story if you look at 10-year-olds and a different story if you look at 80-year-olds. But if you take sort of the midlife period, this is the peak era of kind of family for midlife adults in China. What's crazy, in my opinion, about this is that that is eroding so quickly that it's almost impossible to describe how fast it's eroding because of the implementation of Later, Longer, Fewer campaign and all the policies associated after that with the one-child policy has led to all of a sudden you have a collapse in the number of children women have. That leads to a collapse in siblings, leads to a collapse in aunts and uncles, leads to a collapse in cousins. And we see in the next 30 or 40 years family networks returning to really, really low levels, kind of pre-transitional levels. This has real implications for a country that has a limited pension system and has nursing home beds to support about 2% of the older adult population. When you think about China's ability to provide informal care, which is how they've managed the mass population aging that the country has been experiencing and is projected to continue experiencing at accelerating rates in the next 30 years, that system is eroding very rapidly. You cannot rely on large numbers of children. The average number of parents per child is going up really quickly. The average number of kind of people dependent on midlife individuals in China, changing really rapidly, to the point that by, I think, 2030, China will actually be in a kind of worse kind of caregiving ratio than the United States, for instance. This isn't just China, by the way. From other work that I had done, this is a general feature of population demography, that kinship networks balloon and then they collapse. That's just a general feature of the demographic transition that I think was historically unrecognized. And I think it has implications for all sorts of things like disease diffusion and stuff like that that people haven't thought about. Other work replicates our basic findings. This is work on China. If you were to trace this back, you would see that same basic pattern. Same for the US, same for India. These countries are at different points in their demographic transition, but as the transition is sort of evaporating, the number of family members will decline very rapidly. And so we're in this really quickly defamiliarizing world, and we need to think about what that might look like. I think that can help us to understand some population level challenges like caregiving in the United States. For instance, there's been a lot of attention paid to this caregiving ratio, they call it, the caregiver support ratio, which is the classic measure of trying to understand how demographics might be influencing the kind of public policies. So this ratio historically took the number of 80-plus-year-olds divided by the number of kind of late working life year-olds and said, oh, well, if that's getting worse, it suggests that the population is going to face increasing kind of informal care pressures. But with these kinship models, we can be more precise about that. Not just like the number of people divided by the number of people who might need care divided by the number of people who might be of ages to provide care. We can actually look at the kind of kinship level. What's the average number of family members available and things like that. And in doing that, we find substantial changes in the next 30 or 40 years, although not as dire as the changes that the caregiver support ratio predicts. So I think it's kind of sometimes leads us to understand, at least in different contexts, these demographic changes in new kind of ways. I also think that what's really cool about the microsimulation approach is we can begin to categorize what I'm calling like secondarily affected populations. If you're interested in, for instance, disasters like COVID-19, which I was, we can begin to understand like, all right, well, who's likely to be losing relatives to COVID-19 or experiencing relatives that other people have done work of, experiencing relatives who've been incarcerated or experiencing relatives who have become unemployed. And I think it can really change our kind of public perceptions of major crises by highlighting the kind of social ramifications of them. So early in the pandemic, for instance, there was this broad kind of idea that COVID was really only killing people who were about to die anyway. It was really only killing old people. It's really only affecting the older population. Why should anyone else care? And so we did some kind of early work on this to try and estimate, well, what is the average kind of age of people that are losing loved ones to COVID? And we found that one of the kind of key punchlines is that basically people of all ages are losing loved ones to COVID, and in particular that for every COVID death, about 9 people were losing a loved one to the disease.